Okay, so for Chapter 20 then, what we're going to focus on here is prices and unemployment, the final two major statistics that economists look at, prices, production, and unemployment. We've looked at production in Chapter 19, so let's start to look at prices. Now we in Part 3 of Chapter 19's video, what you would have seen is that we had just started to talk about prices, and one way to actually measure the change in prices, and that being with the GDP deflator. Now that's a very nice statistic for measuring changes in prices, because it's very broad-based. It's everything in the economy. But, right, there are two other measures that are used a bit more commonly, and that would be the Consumer Price Index, which is called the CPI, and the Producer Price Index, which is called the PPI. Now, what the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, does is it's a weighted basket of goods and services that a household typically buys. And what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does is it goes out into the real world, and it actually says, right, like, a typical household buys a box of Kleenex a month. And they'll actually go to the stores and they'll actually track what is the price of a box of Kleenex, right? Or they'll say a typical household buys, 40 gallons of gasoline in a month. Well, they'll find out for a specific city how much that costs. So, and they do this for major cities across the United States. In the case of Wisconsin, I believe we have like 10 or 15 cities that they do this in. So what they then do to construct this index number, right, so to look at this here, to calculate this index number, is that they do it on the basis of a base year. So for the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, it would be total spending in the current year over total spending from a base year. Again, these base years, it's arbitrary. You can choose whatever base year you want. Or it might be chosen for you, but there would have to be some indication of what it is. But the base year does not change. And it doesn't have to be like the first year or the last year. It could be a year in the middle of a series of numbers. Sometimes you pick a specific base year because you're interested for, let's say, political reasons, right? I could pick 2008 if I was interested in the change in prices over the Obama administration, right? Or I could pick, like, I could pick like the years of the Clinton administration, right? If I was just interested in that span of time, right? So I could pick, 92 to 2000, right? So it's often useful for political purposes of why you would pick a series of years if you were concerned about prices during a presidential administration, or if I was concerned about how prices changed since the beginning of the housing crisis, right? So, Consumer Price Index, I would track how much do I spend to buy that basket of goods that consumers typically buy? How much do I spend in the current year, or whatever year it is, over the spending for the base year? And then what I would then do to calculate the change in prices, as I would actually calculate the change in the index numbers, right? So in this case here, right, what we quite simply do, and you'll see this, that I do this, I'm just looking at the typed up notes here. You'll see that I do this on page 2 of the typed up notes. Right, I created an economy that has pens, shirts, and shoes, right? And I gave a price for these goods. And I tracked total spending for those given years. This is for the current year, this for the base year. So in the base year, these were the prices. Notice what did not change: the quantity. The quantity does not change ever in CPI. And it doesn't change because it's a fixed basket. So the only thing that changes is the prices. And so we can see that a basket of goods which costs in the base year $67 now costs $167. I then calculate the CPI as $167 over 67, current year expenditure over base year expenditure, multiply by 100, and now I get a index number that's 249. Now, what would the CPI have been in the base year? It would have actually had the same numerator and denominator. It would have been 67 over 67. The base year always, always, always has a CPI number of 100. If this is 249, right, that's right, more than double what it was in the base year. That would mean that prices had more than doubled from the current year, from the base year to the current year. Now, what then becomes, that's actually pretty useful for us calculating the CPI number, because it actually is used quite a bit for like pension payments, right? If we're trying to make sure that those who are who are retired, to make sure that they're getting the same payments, in terms of purchasing power, we could increase their payments by a certain amount, right? Or state employees in the state of Wisconsin, right? We could get a raise up to the rate of inflation as measured by the CPI, right? And that's just to maintain the purchasing power, how much you can actually buy with your income. Okay, now the CPI number itself is not perfect, just as the GDP statistic was not perfect. And perhaps the biggest flaw about the CPI is that something called the substitution bias. Now, what the substitution bias does is it basically says, right, let's just do this example here, going back to this example here. Look at this, that shoes had tripled in price between the base year and the current year. Yet we presumed that they still bought the same number of shoes. Now, I don't know what else people would have bought other than shoes, but we certainly think that people would substitute away from new shoes if it tripled in price. But the CPI doesn't allow us to do that. Just as in the case of, right, it could go the opposite way, right? Shoes could become cheaper, and I might have purchased actually more shoes. That CPI, that substitution bias is actually quite significant. Another bias within the CPI is something known as the quality bias. And the quality bias says that some things actually increase in price, but they increase in price because the good is actually a better good. So it's not even the same good anymore. The perfect example of this would be something like a car. Right? When I hear stories of my father talking about a car he bought when he was a teenager, at one point he owned a Ford Pinto, which was this car that basically could like catch on fire as it was like driving down the road. Right? It didn't have airbags, it didn't have like anti-lock brakes, it was incredibly fuel inefficient. And I think the price of that car, in terms of like real dollars, is the same price I paid for my Civic. A car that is more reliable, has airbags, doesn't explode, has many more features. It would be a mistake in that case to say that the price of cars had not changed. Or, going outside of that, what if I bought a, to say that a car costs, even more today than it used to. That the important thing there is that the thing being compared is not the same. Yes, it's a car, but it's a much better car that's being purchased today than the ones of the past. And this is true of cars, certainly true of technology, right? In those cases, it's a mistake to think that the prices are actually increasing and that one is getting the exact same amount of stuff. Now, when the price is generally increasing, as measured by percentage changes in the CPI, that would be what we know as inflation. When the price is decreasing, that would be known as deflation. Interestingly enough, economists actually are more concerned about deflation than they are inflation. And the reason why that's the case, we'll look at after the second exam. But basically, it's harder to fix an economy that has falling prices than one that has rising prices. In the case of the U.S., prices haven't been increasing that much the past few years. In some cases, less than 1% for the typical consumer. Now, there are winners and losers to inflation. And this is based on really expectations about inflation. So, let's try to think of an example here, right? If I borrow money, the interest rate that I pay is covering basically two parts. One part that the interest rate covers is the fact that there's a risk I might not pay them back. But even if there was no risk that I would, skip out on the loan, I would still be charged some interest rate to reflect the fact that the money I pay back to them 10 years in the future is going to be less valuable than money that exists right now because of inflation. So, the unfortunate part for the bank that's lending the money is that they have to try to make an expectation about inflation now for 10 years in the future. If they get it wrong, someone's going to win, someone's going to lose. Let's say that they overestimate the actual inflation rate. Well, then in that case they've clearly won out because I'm going to be paying a higher interest rate to reflect that higher inflation rate. If they expect the inflation rate to be lower than it actually is, right, then I win as a borrower. So borrowers win when the expected inflation rate is, when the actual inflation rate is lower than the expected rate. Now, the other individuals that are hurt by inflation would be if I have a fixed income payment. Let's say I get a pension payment, because I retire, and that payment is fixed and there's no increase. Then obviously I lose out by inflation. It's always reducing my earning power, right? Or if I have a fixed salary contract and my salary does not change, obviously I'm going to be hurt by inflation. The causes of inflation, actually we can look at these causes of inflation, but there's basically two major causes, right? And let's actually let's cover that. We're going to cover that in the next part of this video.